The escape pod screamed through the burning atmosphere of Kepler 442b, their heat shields glowing white-hot as they cut through the alien sky. Inside Pod 7, Commander Sarah Chen pressed her bleeding palm against the cracked viewport, watching her ship, humanity's first deep space exploration vessel, break apart in orbit above. Mayday, Mayday, this is the UES Prometheus. We are abandoning ship. Repeat, we are abandoning ship. Captain Morrison's voice crackled through the dying communications system, barely audible over the roar of atmospheric entry. Sarah's pod shuddered violently as it hit a pocket of dense atmosphere. Warning lights flashed red across her control panel. The automatic systems were failing one by one. Her oxygen recycler was damaged, giving her maybe 6 hours of breathable air. The landing thrusters were offline. She was going down hard. Through the chaos, she heard fragments of radio chatter from the other pods. Pod 3 had landed safely in the northern continent. Pod 5 was heading toward what looked like a large ocean. Pod 12 reported severe damage but was still flying. One by one, her crewmates were finding places to land, places where they might survive until rescue came. But rescue wouldn't come. Not for any of them. The Prometheus had been humanity's only deep space-capable vessel, and it now existed as burning debris scattered across an alien world. Earth was 47 light-years away. No one even knew they were here, stranded on a planet that wasn't supposed to exist according to their star charts. Sarah's pod hit the ground with bone-jarring force, bouncing twice before sliding to a stop against a cluster of crystalline trees. The impact knocked her unconscious, and when she woke, night had fallen. Strange sounds echoed through the alien forest, howls and clicks and whispers that spoke of predators she couldn't imagine. She tried the radio, cycling through every frequency. Static answered her calls. Either the other survivors were too far away, or their radios were dead. She was alone on a hostile world with failing life support and no way to call for help. The first alien creature appeared at dawn. It was spider-like but the size of a dog, with too many eyes and mandibles that dripped with some kind of acid. It circled her crashed pod, testing the metal hull with its claws. Sarah held her breath, hoping the hull would hold. After what felt like hours, the creature lost interest and scuttled away into the undergrowth. But others came. Throughout the day, she saw shapes moving in the forest. Some were small and quick, darting between the trees like living shadows. Others were massive, their footsteps shaking the ground as they passed. This world was alive with predators, and she was trapped in a metal can with nowhere to run. Her oxygen gauge continued its steady countdown toward 0. The recycler coughed and wheezed, fighting a losing battle against the growing carbon dioxide levels. She had maybe 4 hours left before the air became unbreathable. After that, she would have to choose between suffocation and taking her chances with the predators outside. Sarah had always prided herself on being practical. She was an engineer, trained to solve problems with logic and mathematics. But there was no engineering solution to being stranded on an alien world with no resources and no hope of rescue. The mathematics of her situation were brutally simple. She was going to die here. She spent her remaining hours recording messages on her personal tablet. Messages for her sister back on Earth, for her parents, for the man she had planned to marry when she returned from this mission. She told them about the wonders they had seen among the stars, about the 3 potentially habitable worlds they had cataloged before everything went wrong. She told them she wasn't afraid, though that was a lie. She was terrified, not just of dying, but of dying alone, 47 light-years from home with no one to witness her final moments. Humans weren't meant to die alone. They were pack animals, social creatures who drew strength from each other. To die in isolation went against everything their species had evolved to be. As her oxygen levels dropped into the red zone, Sarah made her choice. She wouldn't suffocate slowly in this metal tomb. She would open the hatch and face whatever was waiting outside. If she was going to die, she would die on her feet, breathing real air under an alien sky. Her hand hovered over the hatch release. Through the viewport, she could see shapes moving in the twilight. Predators gathering for the night hunt. She took what might be her last breath of recycled air and reached for the control. The hatch hissed open and alien air rushed into her lungs. It was thin but breathable, carrying scents of ozone and something that might have been flowers. She stepped out onto solid ground for the first time in months, her legs shaky from the pod's cramped confines. Above her, 3 moons hung in a star-filled sky unlike anything visible from Earth. The alien forest stretched in every direction, filled with bioluminescent plants that pulsed with soft light. It was beautiful and terrifying and completely inhospitable to human life. Something moved in the undergrowth nearby. Sarah turned toward the sound, her hand closing around the emergency flare gun that was her only weapon. She was about to become prey on a world where she didn't belong, hunted by creatures that had evolved to kill. But she was human, and humans, even alone and afraid, were the most dangerous predators their own world had ever produced. These aliens were about to learn what that meant. The spider thing that had circled her pod earlier emerged from behind a cluster of glowing fungi, its multiple eyes reflecting the moonlight like mirrors. It was bigger than she had thought, nearly the size of a large dog, with legs that ended in razor-sharp claws. Acid dripped from its mandibles, sizzling when it hit the ground. Sarah raised the flare gun with steady hands, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She had 1 shot, maybe 2 if she was lucky. The creature approached slowly, testing the air with antennae that twitched and swayed. It knew she was prey, but it was being careful. Good predators were always careful. The spider thing lunged without warning, covering the distance between them in a single bound. Sarah dove sideways, the flare gun bucking in her hand as she pulled the trigger. The emergency flare struck the creature's center mass, burning through its carapace with a wet hissing sound. The alien let out a shriek that sounded like tearing metal and collapsed, its legs curling inward as it died. But the noise had attracted attention. Sarah could hear movement all around her now, rustling in the undergrowth, the crack of breaking branches. She had maybe 30 seconds before whatever else lived in this forest came to investigate. She grabbed the dead spider thing by one of its legs and dragged it back toward her pod. The body was surprisingly light, mostly hollow spaces between the armor plates, but the claws were solid, sharp as surgical steel. She broke off the longest one and hefted it like a knife. It would have to do. The first wave came from 3 directions at once. More spider things, but smaller, moving in coordinated pack behavior. Sarah backed against her pod's hull, the improvised blade ready. These weren't mindless beasts. They were hunting with strategy. The leftmost creature darted in first, testing her defenses. Sarah slashed with the claw, opening a gash along its side. Green blood sprayed across the ground and the creature retreated with a hiss. But it was just a feint. While she was focused on the wounded one, another attacked from her blind spot. Sarah spun, driving the claw upward just as the creature leaped. The blade punched through its throat, and she used its momentum to slam it against the pod's hull. The impact cracked its skull and it slumped to the ground, twitching. 2 down, but she could hear more coming. The pack tactics were sophisticated. One would distract while others flanked. They communicated through subsonic clicks that she felt more than heard. These weren't just predators. They were intelligent predators. That made them more dangerous, but it also made them predictable. Intelligence followed patterns. Sarah began to move, not away from the creatures, but toward them. It was counterintuitive, the last thing prey was supposed to do. But humans weren't normal prey. Humans were persistence hunters, tool users, problem solvers. When cornered, they didn't just fight, they adapted. She feinted left, then dove right, rolling under a leaping spider thing and coming up behind it. Her claw blade found the soft joint where its head met its body, and she twisted hard. The creature's death throes knocked another one off balance, and Sarah was on it before it could recover. The pack scattered after that, melting back into the forest undergrowth. They had expected easy prey, something that would run or cower or die quietly. Instead, they had encountered something that fought back with tools and tactics they couldn't understand. Sarah stood among the bodies, breathing hard, her makeshift weapon dripping with alien blood. She was alive. More importantly, she had sent a message to whatever else was watching from the shadows. The strange creature from the metal egg was not defenseless. She dragged the bodies into a pile and used her remaining flare to set them ablaze. The flames would serve as both beacon and warning. Fire was one of humanity's oldest tools, and it spoke a universal language that even alien predators could understand. Keep away. While the bodies burned, Sarah began salvaging what she could from her pod. The emergency kit contained a water purification tablet system, enough rations for maybe a week, a basic medical kit, and a small solar charger for her tablet. Not much to build a survival plan around, but humans had survived worse with less. The pod's hull could be partially dismantled to create shelter. The heat shielding was nearly indestructible, perfect for deflecting claws and acid. The interior padding could be repurposed as insulation. The wiring could be stripped for snares and traps. Sarah worked through the night, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She had trained for hostile environment survival, though the training scenarios had never included alien predators with acid saliva. Still, the principles were the same: shelter, water, food, security. As dawn broke over the alien landscape, she had created a defensible position. The heat shielding formed a lean-to shelter against a cluster of the crystalline trees. Tripwires made from stripped wiring surrounded her camp, connected to small charges she had jury-rigged from the pod's battery system. Anyone or anything approaching would trigger an alarm. More importantly, she had begun to understand her environment. The spider things hunted in packs but avoided fire. The larger predators she had heard moving through the forest seemed to be primarily nocturnal. The bioluminescent plants grew in patterns that suggested some kind of seasonal cycle. This world had rules, just like any ecosystem. Sarah had spent her first day learning those rules. Now she could begin to exploit them. She settled back against her shelter and allowed herself a small smile. Every alien predator on this world had millions of years of evolutionary advantage over her. They were faster, stronger, better adapted to this environment, but they had never encountered anything like humanity before. They were about to receive an education in just how dangerous human ingenuity could be. Sarah had been on the planet for 2 weeks when she realized she was being stalked by something much more dangerous than the spider packs. It never showed itself directly, but she could feel its presence, a weight behind her eyes that spoke of intelligence watching, calculating, planning. The signs were subtle at first. Her tripwires would be triggered in the night, but nothing would be there when she investigated. Rocks would be moved in patterns too deliberate to be natural. Scratches appeared on the crystalline trees around her camp, too high to be made by the spider things, too precise to be random. Whatever was hunting her was smart enough to study her defenses before attacking. Sarah had used the 2 weeks well. Her camp had evolved from a simple lean-to into a fortress of salvaged metal and alien materials. She had learned which of the local plants were edible, which ones were poisonous, and which ones could be processed into crude tools. Her water came from a nearby stream that she had tested extensively with her purification tablets. Most importantly, she had begun hunting the hunters. The spider packs had learned to avoid her territory after she had systematically eliminated 3 entire groups. She used their own pack tactics against them, luring them into ambushes with simulated distress calls. The alien equivalent of birds had taught her the local predator warning signals, and she mimicked these to scatter prey when she needed a clear hunting ground. She had fashioned weapons from their remains, spears tipped with their claws, armor plates strapped to her arms and chest, acid sacs repurposed into primitive grenades. She looked nothing like the civilized engineer who had crashed on this world. She looked like something that belonged here, something that had adapted and thrived. But the thing stalking her now was different, bigger, smarter, more patient. Sarah first saw it on the 15th day, just a glimpse of movement in her peripheral vision. Bipedal, roughly humanoid in shape but wrong in proportions. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung nearly to its knees. Its skin seemed to shift and change color, matching the environment around it like a chameleon. It watched her from the edge of her vision, never moving when she looked directly at it. But when she turned away, she could feel it adjusting position, circling her camp, learning her routine. That night, Sarah made a decision that went against every survival instinct she possessed. Instead of staying in her fortified camp, she ventured into the forest. If something wanted to hunt her, she would give it the opportunity. But on her terms. She moved through the alien undergrowth with practiced silence, following game trails she had mapped over the past 2 weeks. The bioluminescent plants provided enough light to navigate, and she had learned to read the forest's mood from the behavior of its smaller inhabitants. The creature followed her, maintaining perfect distance, never quite close enough for a clear shot with her improvised weapons. It was testing her, she realized, seeing how she moved, how she reacted to threats, mapping her capabilities just as she had mapped the local ecosystem. Sarah led it deeper into the forest, toward a clearing where she had set up what the creature would assume was another hunting blind. But this one was different. This one was a trap designed specifically for something with intelligence. The clearing contained the half-eaten carcass of one of the larger predators Sarah had killed days earlier. To most creatures, it would look like an opportunity, fresh meat recently abandoned. But Sarah had seeded the area with carefully placed snares, pressure plates made from pod components, and tripwires connected to sharpened stakes. She settled into position on the far side of the clearing and waited. The creature emerged from the tree line like a shadow given form. Up close, Sarah could see details that made her skin crawl. Its face was almost human in structure, but the proportions were wrong. Too many teeth, eyes that reflected light like mirrors, skin that rippled and shifted with every movement. It approached the carcass cautiously, testing each step. Smart. It suspected a trap but was confident enough in its abilities to spring it anyway. Or perhaps it was arrogant enough to believe it could avoid whatever crude snares a primitive alien might devise. The first tripwire caught it across the shin. The stake that shot up from the ground would have impaled any normal creature, but this thing twisted aside with inhuman grace, the sharpened point barely scoring its hide, but the first trap was just a distraction. While the creature was focused on the immediate threat, it stepped directly onto Sarah's pressure plate. The improvised explosive she had crafted from spider-thing acid sacs detonated with a wet splash, coating the creature's legs with caustic fluid. The thing's scream shattered the night silence, a sound like breaking glass mixed with tearing metal. It stumbled, its camouflage ability flickering as pain disrupted its concentration. For the first time, Sarah could see it clearly. It was magnificent and terrible, clearly the apex predator of this ecosystem. Its muscles moved like cables under skin that seemed to be alive on its own. Claws extended from its fingertips, each one longer than Sarah's improvised blade. This was something that had never known fear, never known anything but dominance over its environment. But now it was hurt, confused, facing something that fought with tools and tactics it couldn't comprehend. Sarah emerged from her hiding spot, moving with deliberate confidence. The creature turned toward her, its mirror eyes reflecting her form. For a moment, they stared at each other across the clearing, predator and prey, though which was which remained to be seen. The creature charged, covering the distance between them in massive bounds despite its injured legs. Sarah didn't run. Instead, she dove forward, rolling under its leap and coming up behind it with her claw spear in hand. The blade found the soft spot behind its knee, and Sarah twisted hard as the creature's momentum carried it past her. Dark blood sprayed across the forest floor, and the thing crashed into a cluster of crystalline trees with enough force to shatter the alien wood. It rolled to its feet with predatory grace, but Sarah could see the change in its posture. This was no longer a casual hunt. This was a fight for survival, and the creature was beginning to realize it might not be the one walking away. Sarah smiled, her teeth white in the bioluminescent glow. She had spent 2 weeks learning to be a predator on this world. Now it was time for the real test. The apex predator limped away into the darkness after their first encounter, leaving a trail of dark blood on the crystalline forest floor. Sarah didn't pursue it. Wounded predators were desperate, unpredictable, and at their most dangerous. Instead, she followed at a distance, learning its patterns, mapping its territory. What she discovered changed everything she thought she knew about this world. The creature wasn't just an individual predator. It was part of a complex social structure. Hidden in a network of caves carved into the cliff face beyond the forest, Sarah found an entire civilization. The beings she glimpsed through her improvised periscope moved with purpose, carrying tools, tending to what might have been agriculture or livestock. They weren't just predators. They were people. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had been fighting an intelligent species, possibly the dominant life form on this planet. Everything she had learned about survival, about adapting to this ecosystem, took on new meaning. She wasn't just an invasive species, she was potentially an act of war. Sarah retreated to her camp to process this information. Her tablet contained detailed anthropological protocols for first contact situations, but those assumed controlled circumstances with backup and support, not a lone human fighting for survival against beings that could blend with their environment and move like liquid death. She spent 3 days observing the cliff settlements from concealment, using mirrors and lenses salvaged from her pod to create a crude telescope. The beings, she started thinking of them as the shadeskin after their camouflage ability, had a complex society with clear hierarchies and specialized roles. Some tended to fungal gardens deep in the caves. Others worked with metals and stones, crafting tools that gleamed in the bioluminescent light. Warriors moved in organized patrols, and Sarah recognized the one she had fought by its distinctive limp and the scars her weapons had left. But most disturbing was what she observed on the third day. The Shadeskin were displaying trophies from other crashes, pieces of human technology, sections of hull plating, even what looked like pieces of environmental suits. Her crew hadn't been the first humans to reach this world. The implications were staggering. Either other ships had crashed here before the Prometheus, or some of her crewmates had survived their own crashes only to be hunted down by the Shadeskin. The trophies were arranged in a place of honor, suggesting the Shadeskin viewed humans as particularly prized prey. That changed the moral equation completely. This wasn't first contact. This was a continuation of an ongoing conflict that Sarah had inherited without knowing it. On the fourth day, the patrols found her camp. Sarah had expected this. The wounded warrior would have reported back about the strange prey that fought with tools and fire. The Shadeskin would send their best hunters to investigate, to determine if this new threat needed to be eliminated. She was ready for them. The camp they found was abandoned, containing nothing but crude decoys made from local materials. Sarah had relocated 2 days earlier to a position of her own choosing. A narrow canyon with multiple escape routes and excellent sight lines for ambush positions. She watched through her improvised scope as the hunting party examined her fake camp. 6 Shadeskin, all warriors, moving with deadly precision. Their leader was the one she had fought, directing the others with hand signals that spoke of military discipline. They were methodical, examining every inch of the camp, following every false trail Sarah had laid. But they were also predictable. Intelligence, even alien intelligence, followed patterns. Hierarchies, chain of command, standard operating procedures. These were universal constants among social species. Sarah had studied military history extensively. Sun Tzu's principles worked whether you were fighting humans or aliens. Know your enemy, choose your battlefield, strike where they were weak while avoiding their strengths. The Shadeskin's strength was their camouflage and their superior physical capabilities. Their weakness was their assumption that intelligence equaled superiority. They expected Sarah to run, to hide, to behave like prey. They weren't prepared for something that fought like a predator but thought like an engineer. The first Shadeskin died without ever seeing Sarah. Her crossbow, constructed from pod springs and polymer cables, sent a bolt through its throat from 200 meters away. The projectile was tipped with concentrated spider-thing venom, causing paralysis within seconds. The hunting party scattered immediately, their camouflage abilities making them nearly invisible against the canyon walls. But Sarah had spent days learning to track them by secondary signs. The displacement of dust, the slight changes in air currents, the way bioluminescent plants reacted to their presence. She moved through the canyon like a ghost, using elevated positions and prepared firing lanes to her advantage. The Shadeskin were superior in direct combat, but Sarah never gave them the opportunity for direct combat. She struck from concealment, then melted away before they could respond. The second kill came from above. A spear dropped from a carefully prepared position onto a Shadeskin trying to scale the canyon wall. The third fell to a deadfall trap triggered by tripwires. The remaining 3 regrouped at the canyon mouth, no longer hunting but clearly planning their withdrawal. They had underestimated their prey and paid for it with half their number. Now they were being smart, cutting their losses before the situation deteriorated further. But Sarah couldn't let them escape. Not all of them. She needed one alive for interrogation. Not through torture, she wasn't a monster, but through demonstration. She needed to communicate with the Shadeskin, to understand the scope of the conflict she had inherited, to discover what had happened to her crewmates. The leader was the obvious choice, the wounded warrior who had first stalked her, who would command respect among its people. Sarah began to maneuver the remaining Shadeskin into position, using carefully placed shots to herd them toward another prepared kill zone. It took 2 hours of careful stalking, but eventually she had them where she wanted them. The leader, isolated from its companions by a rockslide Sarah triggered with a precisely placed explosive charge. The other two Shadeskin would have to choose between abandoning their commander or exposing themselves to rescue it. They chose loyalty, as Sarah had hoped they would. Social predators always did. When the smoke cleared, two more Shadeskin lay dead and their leader was trapped under a pile of rubble, alive but helpless. Sarah approached cautiously, her weapons ready but not directly threatening. The Shadeskin watched her with those mirror eyes, its breathing labored but controlled. No fear, Sarah noted. No surrender, just calculation, waiting to see what this strange prey intended. Sarah settled into a position just out of the creature's reach and began to speak, using the universal language of mathematics and physics to establish communication. Time to find out just how intelligent these aliens really were. The trapped Shadeskin warrior watched Sarah with unwavering attention as she scratched mathematical symbols into the dusty ground between them. Prime numbers first, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, then basic geometric shapes, then simple physics concepts. If these beings had developed technology, they would understand the universal language of science. The warrior's response was subtle but unmistakable. Its pupils dilated slightly when Sarah drew the equations for projectile motion, and she caught it glancing at her crossbow with what might have been professional appreciation. When she moved on to chemical formulas showing how she had created her explosives from local materials, the creature made a soft clicking sound that could have been approval or surprise. After an hour of patient demonstration, the Shadeskin began to respond. Using one clawed finger, it traced modifications to Sarah's equations, showing more elegant solutions to the engineering problems she had presented. Its mathematics were sophisticated, using base 8 notation and geometric principles that suggested a deep understanding of three-dimensional space. But it was the warrior's reaction to Sarah's crude star chart that changed everything. When she drew the constellation patterns visible from this world and marked Earth's approximate location, the Shadeskin became agitated. It began drawing its own symbols, not star charts, but what looked like orbital mechanics diagrams. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. The Shadeskin weren't just technologically advanced, they were spacefaring. The human ships that had crashed here weren't accidents or navigation errors. They had been brought down deliberately. The warrior seemed to recognize the moment of Sarah's understanding. It traced a new diagram in the dirt, a tactical display showing multiple vessels, some marked with symbols that might represent human ships, others bearing different markings. All of them were depicted as wreckage scattered across the planet's surface. This world wasn't just home to an intelligent species. It was a graveyard of spacecraft, a trap that had been claiming victims for generations. Sarah sat back on her heels, processing this revelation. The Prometheus hadn't suffered a random system failure. They had been targeted, their ship deliberately disabled and forced to crash. Her crewmates scattered across the planet weren't survivors, waiting for rescue. They were prey being systematically hunted by a species that had turned shooting down starships into an art form. The warrior watched her reaction carefully, then began a new series of drawings. These showed the hunting process in detail, how ships were tracked and disabled, how survivors were located and eliminated, how the technology was harvested and studied. But there was something different about the human ship symbols. They were drawn larger with more detail, suggesting they held special significance. Sarah pointed to the human ship markers and made a questioning gesture. The warrior's response was immediate and complex, a series of diagrams showing what could only be described as evolutionary pressure. The Shadeskin had been hunting starfaring species for centuries, but humans were different. Humans adapted faster, fought harder, survived longer than any previous prey. The warrior drew what looked like a timeline, showing the progression of human crashes. Early ones ended quickly, with simple hunt-and-kill scenarios. But the more recent crashes showed increasing complexity. Survivors who fought back, who built tools, who turned the hunters into the hunted. The Shadeskin had been forced to evolve their tactics to deal with human ingenuity, and Sarah represented the culmination of that evolutionary arms race. The warrior pointed to her weapons, her armor, her defensive positions, then drew a complex symbol that could only be interpreted as respect. Among a species of apex predators, she had earned recognition as a worthy opponent, but respect didn't mean safety. The warrior began drawing new diagrams, larger hunting parties, coordinated attacks, siege tactics designed to overcome human adaptability through overwhelming force. Sarah's survival hadn't gone unnoticed by the Shadeskin leadership. They were preparing to end the threat she represented with decisive action. Sarah studied the tactical diagrams with professional interest. The Shadeskin military doctrine was sophisticated, emphasizing mobility and stealth over direct confrontation. They had learned from human defensive tactics and developed counters for each innovation. Whatever plan they were developing would be thorough and lethal, but the diagrams also revealed something the warrior probably hadn't intended to show: the location of the central command structure, the place where the Shadeskin coordinated their planet-wide hunting operations. It was marked prominently in every tactical display, suggesting it held both strategic and cultural significance. Sarah began her own drawing, working carefully to convey her intentions. She showed the Shadeskin command center, then drew symbols representing negotiation. Two forces meeting without weapons, exchange of information, mutual benefit. It was a long shot, but the alternative was a war of attrition that would eventually grind her down through sheer numbers. The warrior's reaction was immediate and violent. It thrashed against the rubble holding it, hissing and clicking in obvious distress. The concept of negotiation with prey seemed to violate something fundamental in its worldview. But after the initial outburst, the warrior calmed and studied Sarah's drawings more carefully. It traced the symbols with one claw, its mirror eyes reflecting thoughts Sarah couldn't interpret. Finally, it began drawing again. Not tactical diagrams this time, but what looked like historical records. The images showed the Shadeskin civilization before the starships came. A simple society, living in harmony with their environment, hunting the local fauna for survival. Then the first crashed ships arrived, bringing new technologies and new challenges. The Shadeskin had been forced to adapt or face extinction from the steady stream of alien visitors. The hunting of starships hadn't started as sport or malice. It had been self-defense, a desperate attempt to prevent their world from being overrun by alien species. But over time it had become something more, a source of technological advancement, cultural identity, and military pride. The warrior drew one final image, a massive structure hidden deep in the planetary crust, powered by fusion reactors salvaged from crashed ships. This was how they brought down starships, Sarah realized. Not with primitive weapons, but with a technological infrastructure built from the remains of their victims. Sarah felt a chill of understanding. The Shadeskin weren't just predators, they were survivors, fighting to preserve their world against invasion. From their perspective, every crashed ship was a potential colony vessel, every survivor a scout for larger forces to come. But humans weren't invaders. They were explorers, seeking knowledge and new worlds to study, not conquer. The conflict was based on a fundamental misunderstanding that had been perpetuated by generations of violence. Sarah began drawing again, working to convey concepts that had no easy visual representation. Exploration versus invasion, scientific study versus conquest, the difference between curiosity and aggression. It was slow work, requiring patience and creativity to bridge the gap between two completely different worldviews. The warrior watched intently, occasionally asking for clarification through gesture and counter-drawing. Gradually, Sarah began to see understanding dawn in those mirror eyes. The concept of peaceful exploration was foreign to the Shadeskin experience, but they were intelligent enough to grasp its implications. If Sarah was telling the truth, if humans truly came in peace, then the centuries of conflict had been unnecessary. Both species had been trapped in a cycle of violence based on fear and misunderstanding. The warrior made a decision that would change everything. It began drawing a new set of symbols, directions to the command center, safe passage codes, the political structure Sarah would need to navigate to reach the Shadeskin leadership. It was offering her the chance to end the war. But first, she would have to survive the journey to the heart of enemy territory. Sarah freed the warrior from the rubble using a lever system improvised from debris. The Shadeskin watched her work with what might have been curiosity, its head tilting as she solved the engineering problem with tools it hadn't expected her to possess. When the warrior stood, towering over her by nearly 2 feet, Sarah felt the familiar spike of adrenaline that had kept her alive for the past month, but she forced herself to remain calm. to project the confidence of someone extending trust rather than showing weakness. The warrior tested its injured leg, then made a series of complex gestures that Sarah interpreted as gratitude mixed with wariness. It pointed toward the distant mountains where the command center was hidden, then at Sarah, then traced a symbol that clearly meant death. The journey would be dangerous, the warrior was warning her. Many Shadeskin would see her as prey to be eliminated regardless of any diplomatic mission. Sarah understood. She was asking an entire species to overcome millions of years of predatory instinct based on the word of a single human who had killed dozens of their kind. The warrior was taking an enormous risk by helping her, possibly signing its own death warrant if the leadership viewed its actions as treason. But the alternative was the continuation of a war that would eventually consume both species. They traveled at night, when the Shadeskin's natural camouflage abilities were most effective. Sarah had crafted a crude ghillie suit from local materials, but she knew it was woefully inadequate compared to her companion's adaptive skin. She would be relying on the warrior's protection and knowledge of safe routes through Shadeskin territory. The journey took them through landscapes that defied earthly comparison. Forests of crystalline trees that sang in harmonic frequencies when the wind passed through them. Vast fungal plains where bioluminescent spores drifted like fallen stars. Canyons carved from stone that seemed to absorb light, creating passages of absolute darkness. Throughout the journey, Sarah continued her communication with the warrior, whom she had begun thinking of as Scout, based on its obvious expertise in reconnaissance and navigation. They developed a working vocabulary of gestures and drawings, building on the mathematical foundation they had established. Scout told her about the Shadeskin history, how they had evolved from solitary predators into a cooperative society, how the arrival of the first crashed ships had forced rapid technological advancement, how the hunting of starships had become both their greatest achievement and their defining cultural practice. In return, Sarah shared human history, the gradual expansion into space, the peaceful contact with other species, the exploration missions that sought knowledge rather than conquest. She showed Scout images on her tablet of Earth, of human cities, of the International Space Station that had been humanity's first permanent foothold beyond their homeworld. Scout's reactions were complex and conflicted. The concept of a species that explored without conquering challenged fundamental assumptions about intelligence and power. But the warrior was adaptive, as all successful predators had to be, and gradually began to accept that humans might represent something genuinely new in the Shadeskin's experience. On the third night, they encountered a Shadeskin patrol. Sarah felt Scout tense beside her as the shadows resolved into 6 armed warriors moving through the canyon ahead. These weren't random hunters, they were military, equipped with weapons that gleamed with technological sophistication. One of them carried what looked like an energy weapon powered by a compact fusion cell. Scout made a series of rapid gestures, and Sarah understood she was being told to remain absolutely still while her companion handled the situation. She watched as Scout approached the patrol, its camouflage ability shifting to match the surrounding stone so perfectly that Sarah lost track of its position. The conversation that followed was conducted in subsonic frequencies that Sarah felt in her bones rather than heard. Scout was clearly arguing with the patrol leader, gesturing back toward where Sarah was hidden. The discussion grew heated, with aggressive postures and threatening displays that made Sarah's hand drift toward her weapons. Then one of the patrol members pointed directly at Sarah's hiding spot. Her camouflage wasn't good enough. They had detected her heat signature or scent or some other characteristic she hadn't thought to mask. The patrol spread out in a classic encirclement pattern, their weapons trained on her position. Sarah emerged from concealment slowly, her hands visible but ready to move if the situation deteriorated. The patrol leader examined her with obvious fascination, its mirror eyes reflecting her image with predatory intensity. This was the first live human most of them had ever seen, she realized. To them, she was both curiosity and trophy. Scout moved between Sarah and the patrol, speaking rapidly in those subsonic tones. The warrior was clearly vouching for her, explaining her mission, arguing for safe passage. But Sarah could see skepticism in the patrol members' postures. The idea of a human seeking peaceful contact was beyond their conceptual framework. The patrol leader made a decision. Instead of killing Sarah immediately, it gestured for the group to form a traveling formation with her at the center. They were taking her to the command center as a prisoner rather than a diplomat, but they were taking her alive. Scout shot Sarah a look that conveyed both apology and determination. This wasn't the plan, but it was better than immediate execution. Sarah nodded slightly, indicating she understood. She would have to prove her peaceful intentions to the Shadeskin leadership in person, under circumstances far less favorable than she had hoped. The forced march continued for 2 more days. Through increasingly militarized terrain, Sarah saw defensive positions carved into cliff faces, weapon emplacements disguised as natural formations, and patrol routes that covered every possible approach to the mountains. The Shadeskin Command Center wasn't just hidden, it was fortress, built to withstand assault from spaceborne attackers. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Sarah began to see evidence of the technological infrastructure the Shadeskin had built from salvaged starships. Power conduits ran along seemingly natural rock formations. Sensor arrays disguised as crystalline outcroppings tracked their approach. Most impressively, she caught glimpses of massive construction projects deep in the mountain valleys. What looked like shipyards working to reverse engineer captured technology. The Shadeskin weren't just hunters. They were military engineers, building a defensive capability that could challenge any future invasion force. The crashed ships weren't just trophies. They were the foundation of a technological revolution that was transforming Shadeskin society. On the final day of travel, they reached the command center itself. Sarah's first impression was of scale. The facility was enormous, extending deep into the mountain core through natural and artificial caverns. Fusion reactors hummed with power generated from salvaged ship cores. Manufacturing centers produced weapons and equipment that blended Shadeskin biotechnology with alien engineering principles, and everywhere, displayed with reverence and pride, were the remains of conquered starships, hulls bearing the markings of a dozen different species, each one representing a victory in the Shadeskin's ongoing war against invasion. But it was the newest display that made Sarah's blood run cold. Fresh wreckage, still bearing scorch marks from atmospheric entry, pieces of hull plating that she recognized, equipment that had once belonged to the Prometheus, and mounted prominently among the technological trophies, the personal effects of her dead crewmates. Sarah forced herself to remain calm, to project the confidence of a diplomat rather than the grief of a survivor. But inside, her resolve hardened into something approaching absolute determination. She had come here to negotiate peace, but she was also here to honor the dead. The Shadeskin leadership would listen to her proposal. One way or another, they would understand that humanity was more than they had ever imagined. The patrol leader gestured toward the central command chamber, where Sarah would face the ultimate test of her diplomatic mission. Everything she had learned, every skill she had developed, every alliance she had forged would be put to the test in the next few hours. She followed the escort deeper into the mountain, toward a confrontation that would determine the fate of 2 species. The command chamber was a vast natural cavern enhanced with Shadeskin biotechnology and salvaged alien systems. Bioluminescent organisms had been cultivated to provide steady illumination, while holographic displays created from captured technology showed tactical information from across the planet. The air hummed with power and purpose. At the center of it all sat the Shadeskin hierarchy, 5 ancient warriors whose scarred hides spoke of countless battles. They arranged themselves in a precise formation that suggested both council and tribunal, their mirror eyes reflecting Sarah's image as she was brought before them. Scout moved to stand beside the central figure, speaking rapidly in those subsonic tones. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but she could read the body language. Scout was presenting her case, arguing for her right to speak, vouching for her intentions despite the deaths she had caused. The central hierarchy member, clearly the supreme leader, studied Sarah with the focused attention of a predator evaluating new prey. When it spoke, its voice was deeper than Scout's, resonating through frequencies that made Sarah's bones ache. Scout translated using their established gesture language. The leader wanted to know why a human who had killed so many Shadeskin warriors believed she deserved to live, let alone speak. Sarah had prepared for this moment during the long journey to the command center. She began with mathematics again, establishing her intelligence and peaceful intentions. Then she moved to more complex concepts, the difference between defensive action and aggressive conquest, the principles of proportional response, the human concept of necessary versus wanton violence. She drew diagrams showing her crashes, her desperate fight for survival, her growing understanding of shadeskin society. Each kill had been defensive. Each trap had been triggered only when threatened. She had never attacked unprovoked, never sought to expand her territory beyond what she needed to survive. The hierarchy listened with varying degrees of skepticism. One member gestured dismissively, clearly advocating for immediate execution. Another seemed intrigued by Sarah's tactical innovations. The leader remained neutral, gathering information before making judgment. Sarah shifted to her main argument, the fundamental misunderstanding that had driven centuries of conflict. She showed them star charts of human space, marking exploration routes and peaceful first contact scenarios. She displayed images of multi-species cooperation, of humans working alongside aliens in research and trade relationships. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Several hierarchy members rose to their feet, their camouflage abilities flickering with agitation. The concept of voluntary cooperation between species was so foreign to their experience that they interpreted it as deception, but Sarah had expected this resistance. She activated her tablet's communication system, broadcasting on frequencies she had learned from studying local fauna. What emerged wasn't human language, but music, specifically Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the piece humanity had chosen to represent their species in the Voyager Golden Records. The effect was electric. The shadeskin had never encountered anything like music, the deliberate arrangement of sound for aesthetic rather than communicative purposes. It spoke of a species with time for beauty, for creation beyond survival necessity. As the symphony played, Sarah began drawing again, not tactical diagrams or mathematical proofs, but art. Human faces, landscapes from Earth, the view of their planet from space. She showed them a species that created as well as destroyed, that built as well as conquered. The central leader made a gesture and Scout translated. The hierarchy wanted to know about human military capabilities. If humans were truly peaceful, how had they developed the technology for interstellar travel? How had they survived long, enough to reach the stars? Sarah's answer was complex but honest. Humans were indeed capable of violence, had indeed fought wars throughout their history, but they had also learned to channel that aggression into exploration, competition, and the drive to overcome challenges rather than simply destroy opponents. She showed them images of human cities, of the transformation from scattered tribes to global civilization. She explained how conflict had driven innovation, but cooperation had enabled survival. Humans were predators, but they were also builders. The hierarchy deliberated in subsonic frequencies that made the cavern walls vibrate. Sarah waited, knowing that the next few minutes would determine not just her fate, but potentially the future relationship between their species. Finally, the leader spoke again. Scout's translation was complex, requiring multiple attempts to convey alien concepts in human terms. The shadeskin would consider a cessation of ship-hunting activities, but they required guarantees. How could they be certain that peaceful contact wouldn't simply be the prelude to invasion? How could they trust a species that had already proven capable of adapting to shadeskin hunting tactics? Sarah had anticipated this question. She made her final proposal, not just peace but alliance. Humans possessed knowledge the shadeskin needed: medical technology, agricultural techniques, manufacturing processes that could improve their quality of life. In return, the shadeskin could provide humans with their biotechnology, their understanding of adaptive camouflage, their mastery of defensive architecture. Both species were survivors shaped by conflict but capable of growth. Together they could create something neither could achieve alone. The offer sparked intense debate among the hierarchy. Sarah watched their body language, reading agreement and opposition in equal measure. Scout added arguments of its own, pointing to Sarah's survival skills as proof of human adaptability and value. But it was the oldest hierarchy member who made the decisive statement. It approached Sarah directly, studying her with eyes that had seen the rise of shadeskin civilization from its earliest days. When it spoke, Scout's translation was simple and profound. The ancient warrior recognized Sarah as a true predator, one who had earned her place through skill and determination. If humans could produce individuals of such capability, they deserved consideration as equals, rather than prey. The vote, when it came, was narrow but decisive. 3 members of the hierarchy agreed to authorize a limited peace accord, while 2 maintained that the risks were too great. The leader cast the deciding vote in favor of attempting cooperation. But the agreement came with conditions. Sarah would remain on the planet as a liaison and guarantee of human intentions. Other human ships would be allowed to land peacefully, but only at designated sites under Shadeskin supervision. Any sign of military buildup or territorial expansion would result in immediate resumption of hostilities. Sarah accepted the terms without hesitation. She had come to this world as an explorer and had become a diplomat. Now she would serve as a bridge between species, helping to build trust where none had existed before. As the formal ceremonies concluded, Scout approached her with what might have been the Shadeskin equivalent of a smile. Through gestures and drawings, it conveyed a simple message. Sarah had accomplished something unprecedented in Shadeskin history. She had faced their greatest warriors and not just survived, but earned their respect. The war was over. The real work was just beginning. 6 months later, Sarah stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed Joint Research Station, watching as the first official human delegation prepared to land. The facility was a masterpiece of combined engineering, human structural principles merged with Shadeskin biotechnology to create something that belonged naturally to this world while serving the needs of both species. She had kept her word, serving as liaison and cultural interpreter while the peace accord slowly took shape. The process had been difficult, requiring patience and creativity to bridge the gap between 2 completely different civilizations, but it had worked. The incoming ship bore the markings of the Earth Diplomatic Corps, along with scientists, engineers, and specialists chosen for their ability to work in cross-species environments. They would find a world no longer hostile to human presence, guided by a survivor who had learned to see enemies as potential allies. Scout joined her at the observation window, its camouflage ability now used to create shifting patterns of beauty rather than concealment. The former warrior had become her closest collaborator in the peace process, helping to translate not just languages but entire worldviews. As the human ship touched down with perfect precision, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had crashed on this world as a lone survivor, fighting for her life against creatures she didn't understand. She was now witness to the birth of an alliance that could reshape both species' futures. Humanity had earned its place among the stars not through conquest, but through the courage to seek understanding even with their deadliest enemies. And sometimes, Sarah thought with satisfaction, that was the most human thing of all.